Welcome to the Hunt Backcountry Podcast. This is episode number 505, and today we are speaking with Scott from Rocky Mountain Big Game Recovery. And Scott tells us his story about beginning to use his dog to help hunters recover big game animals in the Rocky Mountain West. For some of you listeners, maybe that's a new concept. For many of you, you're thinking, hey, that's nothing new. Guys have been using dogs to aid in hunting, sometimes before and after the shot for many years. But it is new to use dogs for big game recovery in the Rocky Mountain West specifically. Scott tells us about that, how legislation has changed, how there are more trackers and dog teams willing to help hunters with big game recoveries in the Rocky Mountain West, and a whole lot more. This is a great episode. I was super excited to learn of some of these opportunities and just know more about how this process works, what it costs, what to do if you think you might need assistance with a big game recovery, and a whole lot more. As always, guys, we appreciate your feedback. This episode actually happened because it was a suggestion from one of you guys. So if you listening, yes, you have other suggestions for guests or topics or any questions for us, reach out anytime. Send us an email to podcast@exomountaingear.com. We'd love to hear from you. And also, if you are enjoying the show, it would help us tremendously if you can leave a rating or review in whatever podcast app you're using. Most of you guys are in Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and in both places, you can leave a rating for the show. Thank you for taking the time to do that. Right now, let's go ahead and dive into this great conversation with Scott. Well, Scott, welcome to the podcast. We had a call, just you and I, last week about setting this up. And after talking with you then, it made me even more excited to talk with you today for the podcast. So thanks for taking the time to come on and do this with us.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me here, Mark.
And kudos to listeners. This was not only a topic that was suggested by you guys, listeners of the podcast, but also turned to me on specifically to your organization, Scott, which is how I ended up reaching out to you for this topic. So that said, kick us off with just an introduction for a little bit about you and then how things kind of got rolling with Rocky Mountain Big Game Recovery.
To start off with, Mark, I've been bow hunting. I've been hunting pretty close to my entire life ever since I was a little kid, but just doing it for myself or picking up a bow. I've probably been doing that for about 45 years now. Over that amount of time, every couple of years you might shoot an animal and you're not able to find it. I had this happen several times over the 45 years. And then about 8 years ago, well, I take that back. Time flies, but it was 10 years ago because I was even thinking about it the other day. It happened in 2014. I was kind of had a buck around the house here, and I kind of was targeting him. I was able to put an arrow in him in November of 2014. And I tracked him quite a distance. In fact, I didn't even recover him that day. I didn't recover him for several days. But the whole time I was tracking, it started rolling through my mind, there's got to be an easier way to do this. And I had thought about that before, but when I did recover this deer, and afterwards I just Googled, tracking dog. I always wondered if a dog could do this. So I just Googled it quick. Immediately, United Blood Trackers popped up. I was intrigued by what the guys back east in the eastern United States, the level they had taken the tracking dog to for tracking deer and a few bears, back far east. And I was intrigued by it. I wanted to learn more about it, and they're getting ready for an event. It was a big get together for they called it Track Fest, and it was back in Oklahoma City. And I thought, I am going to go and check this out. So I didn't even have a tracking dog yet. I just went there for 3 days of seminars, watched them do dog testing, and I found it so fascinating that I was like, I'm going to try to do that. And that's how I started with the tracking dog. I didn't even, I didn't even, as soon as the event was over, I started researching and finally found a puppy, and the ball started to roll. So that's how I started tracking. That was 8 years ago when I started. With the United Blood Trackers, you could put your name on their website. They At the top of the page, they have a place called Find a Tracker, and it gives you a map of the United States. And if you needed help recovering an animal, you could just go onto that website, and you still can today. And you can click on the state that you're located in, and it would give you a list of all members of United Blood Trackers on the Find a Tracker. I did that immediately, even though I only had a 4-month-old puppy. I'd been training it all summer. I started her when she was 8 weeks old. And at the end of summer, she was 4 to 4.5 months old. We had done nothing but practice tracks. But she was running practice tracks out to about 700 yards. Opening day of archery in Colorado, I got a phone call, and I thought, here we go. We're going to try this. And I went out with the dog and met the hunter. It was about 8 hours after the shot. It was a mule deer, and she tracked that mule deer 1.5 miles. Now, she was only 4.5 months old at the time. She's a dachshund, standard dachshund. But at the time, she weighed between 7 and 8 pounds. So she was just this tiny little thing. To watch her go, 1.5 miles on this mule deer was just, I couldn't believe what was happening, how she was picking this up. Anyway, that's kind of how I started. But I started, after that first season, I started a Facebook page for just me and my dog. We called it Rocky Mountain Big Game Recovery. And over the next couple of years, guys started getting a hold of me going, hey, I'm watching your page. I'd really like to do this. We would help them as much as we could, maybe to get a dog and get it started. And it was by about 2000. Well, it was 3 years ago this month. There was 5 of us that were running a tracking dog here in Colorado, couple in Wyoming, and we got together. We decided to take the Facebook page, Rocky Mountain Big Game Recovery. We started a nonprofit. We elected a board, set a set of bylaws, and that's how Rocky Mountain Big Game Recovery started. And as of today, the last count I had, there was 54 tracking teams in the network of trackers.
Let's talk about the development, the progression of using dogs for tracking specifically in the West, in the Rockies. Because to me, like growing up in the Midwest, I've been somewhat aware of dog tracking. I know, friends out east who, I mean, shoot, in some states you can still use dogs for hunting, much less tracking. But you have more of a dog use culture out east. It's more legal, it's more common. So there's that aspect of it, but even the practical challenges of using dogs in the West, we can talk about states and legality, but even things like, man, so much bigger, so much more vast, so much more spread out. The track itself could go such a greater distance. Finding a tracker, you could call or not because you're in the mountains and don't have cell service, but someone instead of maybe being you could say in state, but in state could be 10 hours away versus maybe 4 hours away, right? Where you have a higher density of people out east. So I think to me, I was interested when this topic came up to understand what does tracking actually look like in the Western Rockies? Because even though I've been aware of the use of dogs for tracking game and for recovery. I just honestly hadn't thought about it in that Western context. Um, so talk to us about that. Like, how was it growing out west? What states is it legal? What have been some of the even recent, by recent, I mean 5 to 10 years ago since you've been doing this changes, and things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like we talked the other day, and like you just mentioned, the tracking dog really started back east, back in the late 70s. And New York was the first state to legalize the use of a leash tracking dog. They were already using dogs a little bit in the South, but they're running off lead. In some of those states, they still do that. But as it got legalized, other states started to take notice that how successful they were, using a leash tracking dog to track primarily white-tailed deer. It slowly moved across the United States. Each state would slowly legalize it. Colorado didn't legalize it until 2015. My first tracking season was in 2019. So most of the tracks that I did in 2018 were either in Colorado, but Nebraska had already legalized it too. So I do a lot of hunting in Nebraska. So I was running tracks in Nebraska also. Wyoming didn't legalize the use of a dog until 2019. And I live really close to the Wyoming border, within 20 miles. And it just kind of word got out there. And in fact, we did our first track in Wyoming on opening day in 2019 and recovered a really nice bull. And that was Wyoming in 2019. Utah followed suit. I'm not quite sure what year they did it. Idaho legalized it, and Washington State was the last state I know that legalized it, and that was in 2022. But you can take states like, I remember when they legalized it in Iowa. That must have been about 2020, maybe. West Virginia was 2021. The only states that are not legal to use a leash tracking dog right now is there's 4 states in the West: Arizona, Nevada, Oregon, and California. You might be able to a little bit in California. They have some pretty strange laws there, but is it as legal as it is here in Colorado? No. And then there's 3 states in the New England area where you can't use a tracking dog. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I mean,
What else did you ask in that? It was a big question. What else did you ask in
no,
that?
yeah, I mean, you covered it well just in terms of how it has progressed in the West. In terms of legality, how it's spread. But I guess part of like where we can go next would be questions on, because the mountains are more vast, like, what does it generally look like? Like, I'm sure there's no, hey, here's the standard, here's exactly how this happens. But when you're dealing with guys out elk hunting in the mountains, tell us a little bit about what that typically looks like. If a request comes into you, how do you determine whether you can or can't help them? Maybe you can help them via another resource. One thing you mentioned to me before, which I think is really cool, you mentioned all the trackers in your group, and let's say they call you, Scott, and you're unavailable. You can turn around and let 50 plus other trackers know about this request and then maybe link them up with someone else, right?
That's right. Well, this is how tracking is in the West. You take the guys back east, and I got a lot of friends that do this, in Michigan, Illinois, Missouri. The thing about back east is it's not uncommon, like in Michigan, you can have 12 deer tags. So these guys are getting phone calls and running 80 to 100 tracks every hunting season and never going more than 20 or 30 miles from their house. Now you get out west here, you're lucky if you even have one deer tag in the state of Colorado. So now we have a lot less deer that are being hunted. Same with the elk. You only have one elk tag. And, we don't have in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, there isn't a road every mile or two, section it off like it does in farm ground. So what my typical September is the big month for us during the archery season. I do run quite a few rifle calls, but those don't start up until October. But let's take, for example, September. I'll get a phone call. Guy will either get me off of United Blood Trackers or he'll find us on our website at Rocky Mountain Big Game Recovery. There's a whole list of all the members on there. They'll pick one of the members that is closest to them wherever they are and call us and I'll run them through all the questions. And there's about 50 questions I'm going to ask a guy when he calls with help. The big one is out west here is where are you? Many times guys will say, well, I'm on top of Black Mountain. Well, every mountain range in Colorado has a Black Mountain in it. So I need to be specific to the game management unit that you're in. The next question is, what is the closest city to you? Now I can start to take a look at how far away they really are. Another one is the next question is, how close can I get a vehicle to where you took the shot? Because I will get phone calls. Well, from this trailhead, I'm back into the national forest or into the wilderness area 10 miles. Well, right there, I'm probably not going to do that track just because I don't have 2 to 3 days to blow to come in there and find your elk. And that does happen once in a while. The good thing about the network is with Rocky Mountain Big Game Recovery and us having 54 teams on there now, is a guy will call me. I'll run him through the questions. I'll try to help him out as much as I possibly can, just over the phone. But once I get all of his information, that person that calls me doesn't have to sit there and call every tracker that's on our map and on the website. I will send out a mass text through WhatsApp to all the tracking teams in the network. So everybody gets it immediately. And a lot of times, it kind of depends on where they're at. We might have a tracking team already close to them that's going to be able to go in there and help that person out. Because I'll just put on there the guy's name, his phone number, what he's trying to do, maybe a few little specifics that I got, and they'll get a hold of him. Now, will they be there in the next 5 minutes? Probably not, because a lot of times they'll be on another track somewhere. But it could be, hey, I'll be to you within the next 3 to 4 hours. And last year, with September, we didn't keep count. I do this every year. I start the year, I'm going to keep track of every phone call that I get. Well, after 2 or 3 days after opening day, I can't just sit here and write down every phone call that I get. So I would assume, taking a stab in the dark, that last September, the network, we probably got about 300 phone calls just in September alone. And, out of that many phone calls, this last year, each year it gets a little bit better, but I would say 75 to 80% of the time, we ended up getting a dog in there to help the guys out, which is pretty good numbers considering the vastness of the Rocky Mountain region.
Yeah.
Personally, it's not uncommon for me to drive 3 to 4 hours to meet a guy. And you have to do that. They could be 50 miles away the way the crow flies. But by the time I drive around that mountain range to get onto the other side, it can take a while to get over there. Plus, when you get over there, now we got to get from the vehicle to where they took the shot. And that can sometimes take just as long to get in there.
The logistics of that have to just at certain times be like, hey, I'd love to help, but there's no way. Like, no one can get there. Like you said, they're too far in to the wilderness or the backcountry, things like that.
Absolutely.
For hunters, this is a new concept to them. I mean, it's new for myself in this Western context. I'm thinking of, so many elk hunts I've been on, things like that. Unfortunately, I haven't, knock on wood, been in situations where I've really needed tracking. But for people hearing this, considering this, thinking, oh man, this is a resource that I don't want to have to take advantage of, but if I need it, it could be really helpful. What do they need to know? Like, what does the hunter need to know? And by that, I just mean practically, how long should they wait? How long is too long to wait to contact? What maybe they have a hit on an elk and they're not finding any blood, for example, but they think, oh no, I arrowed that thing. I mean, there's so many different little details and situations from the hunter perspective
Hmm.
to kind of consider and process and to know, is this the right call? Should I call for tracking? Shouldn't I? Has it been too long? Am I giving up too quick and calling too soon? Just like, yeah, just help us think through some of those things on examples of good and bad of, hey, here's what the hunter can do to have the best chance at success with calling us.
You know, to answer your first question, there is really no time where it'd be too soon or too late to call a tracking team in. You know, if it's too soon, I mean, I've helped quite a few guys just kind of gather themselves and get into the moment. What I like to tell guys is you're in the moment. You've taken a shot on an elk. You know, adrenaline's going, is pumping. We're pretty excited about everything that just happened. My best advice to guys is to sit back. Don't even walk over to where the animal was standing when he was hit with an arrow or a rifle. Just sit back and run the whole scenario through your mind. Try to collect as much information and calm yourself down, and try to remember everything that has just taken place. The next thing to do is to go over and look for any sign. When I go into a hit site, or any of us do, we almost treat it like a crime scene. What evidence do we have at the hit site? Is there any blood there? Is there any hair there? If it's a rifle, is there any bone fragments there? Is there any gut matter? You know, just try to put yourself in the moment and see what kind of evidence. And then you can usually guys know what direction the animal took off from that position. Follow that trail for a little bit. See if you start seeing any sign. And if you start finding blood, there's really no need for me to call, or for any need for you to call me at that point. If you're getting sign and you can track it yourself, continue the line. A big one is when you do take that shot, try to another good thing guys need to know is anatomy of the animal that they're hunting. Okay. Where did I hit? If it is an arrow and he spun around, was the arrow sticking out the other side? Did we get a pass through on this thing? Is my arrow, did I get enough of a pass through that the arrow's laying here? Arrow's going to give us a lot of information. But the big one is wherever you might have hit that animal, let's wait the appropriate amount of time before we even start tracking. Now you could give me a call and ask me my advice on how long you should wait before you start tracking. If you're pretty sure that you double lunged him, you got to pass through that. You're probably not even going to think about calling me. I have had those calls before, and it happens a couple times a year where we will go in on a double longer. But you start moving back in the animal a little bit, maybe liver, right in front of the diaphragm. I tell guys, let's wait. I like to wait at least 8 hours on a liver hit. And guys should almost do that themselves, even if the dog isn't going to come in. And, you get maybe a shot right in front of the hams, a strict gut shot. Very recoverable with a dog. very recoverable without a dog, if you do the right thing. And here's where guys screw up. They'll wait 1, 2. Some guys will call, oh, I waited a half an hour before I went to track. And he know that he hit him in front of the hams. What he probably did is got in there, the bull might have bedded within between 400 and 800 yards. And as they were tracking, they probably got him up. And once you get them up out of their bed, who knows where they might go to. Sometimes, they'll go miles. If you're fortunate enough, and sometimes they can only go a few feet. But wait times is a big one for guys. But let's say you are following that blood trail and you get in there 200 yards, and all of a sudden it vanishes away. You can't continue the line. That is the best time. That is when you want to start thinking, should I get a dog in here? And if we can get a dog in there, within a reasonable amount of time, my best advice is I tell guys, I want you to turn around and walk back to your vehicle, or go to a place that we can meet you and wait for us to show up. Many times, guys that don't know about a tracking dog will go back to camp, get their buddies, and they go out there and they start to grid search. And once you start a grid search, will a grid search work? Yes, it will. But it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. But what you do with the grid search is you might have a buddy that walks across the line, or you might not see blood there, but it can be there. And you brush you step in it with your boot or your pant leg, and you start walking off to the side of the mountain over here, trying to see if he's laying under a tree over here. What you've done is they come in there with the dog later, and the dog will pick up that line and turn, and I can tell where every guy has walked as they were grid searching. So if we can get a dog in there before you grid search, your chances of recovery are much, much higher. If I can work a line that hasn't been screwed up through a grid search. But that is the best time. I hope I'm answering your question right, but that is the best time to give me a call. We get plenty of calls that, hey, I shot this out yesterday, or 36 hours ago. Can I come in there with a dog and find him? Sure, I can. And I have some states have a law. Wyoming has a law where we can't do it past the 72-hour mark. That's 3 days. That's a long time. Have I found animals at the 72-hour mark? Absolutely. I one of the first ones that I ever did that was at the 72-hour marks. Guys, they kept walking by it. That animal was laying 50 yards from the hit site, and they couldn't find it for 3 days. My dachshund found that thing in 5 minutes, but you got to put it. It's another one of them scenarios where he was in thick cover. He shot, the thing took off up the side of the mountain, and all he could think of, well, he was running that direction up the side of the mountain. So they spent 3 days in there grid searching, going up the side of the mountain looking for that animal. What that thing did is went about 50 yards, turned, ran down the side hill, the slope, went back in the canyon, ran around behind where he got shot and fell over dead. So when I say he was laying 50 yards from him, he was 50 yards behind him. And when I came in there with the dog 3 days later, it actually ran a 300-yard track and did the loop and came back around behind him, and there he was laying there dead.
Have you noticed patterns in animal behavior with your tracks? Like you hear hunters say things like, "Hey, a hit elk or deer or whatever will tend to run more downhill than uphill, or will tend to run towards thick cover vegetation, or will tend to run towards water." There's these different things that hunters will say. Since you've been on so many tracks of animals that are difficult to find and then recovered them, have you noticed patterns like that?
Yes. A lot of guys will, and most of us think this. You shoot an elk. Let's just focus on elk. Let's say a bull elk. You shoot him, it's a great hit. This guy's hurt, right? That people just automatically assume that they are going to run downhill because it's easier to run. They can pick up momentum to get away. I find that will they go downhill? Absolutely. Do they most of the time? No, they do not. If you shoot an animal, let's say he's side hill in the mountain, and a lot of times, guys will call me and we ran out of blood. We can't find any blood, and we've been looking and looking. We can't find any. They've been concentrating downhill because they're just assuming that he's going to go downhill. And I've hey, have you looked above you yet? No, he wouldn't go up there because he's hurting. I'll tell you what, when they're hurting and they're about and they're getting ready to maybe expire, they will take the high ground. I don't think incline affects deer, elk, any wild animal. They really don't care about terrain, but I think they like to take the high ground. They can bed up and they can look down the slope and see if they're being followed. So I would say that most of the elk that we recover, probably as high as 90% at some point, turned and went into the nastiest stuff that you could imagine and were going uphill. I mean, steep uphill. Um, so you got to take that out of your mind. Where guys start to think, well, I'm a hurt animal. Where am I going to go? And they look at the train and go, well, it's going to be a lot easier for me to go that direction down that trail. When in actuality, you sometimes you should look at what's the worst place I could possibly go, and that's the direction that they have turned and went to. I just find it time and time again like that. So, but they will go downhill. If they do go to water, it's usually they say gut shots always go to water. Not necessarily; they'll go uphill too, but a lot of times those are the ones that might go downhill and try to find water. But yeah, you got to take that that thought. Where's the easiest place for me to go to? Get it out of your mind, and we just don't know. I mean, the dog is going to show us what direction they went.
What about, this is gonna be a difficult question to answer. Is there anything you have observed or feel like you've taken away as patterns from the hunter's perspective? Meaning you're called into these situations, and as you said, a lot of your work is archery elk, where something, I don't even want to say went wrong, but obviously an animal is not recovered quickly and easily. In either observing things or hearing the stories, do you feel like there's any sort of pattern, consistency on what actually, quote unquote, did go wrong? Meaning, was it, hey, rushed shots? Was it lack of penetration? Was it, deflections of arrow? Like I could think of so many different things, and maybe there is no consistency or pattern, but I'm just curious from your perspective, if we talk about, well, what went wrong with the shot or the hunter or a decision the hunter made? Is there anything that has any sort of consistency?
Well, it could be any one of those that I get the phone call. You know, I would say they're calling me because they can't find their animal. So now we already know that something probably went wrong. Did the arrow in flight hit a twig that they weren't seeing? Was the shot? Here's another one. Guys really need to know your equipment. What is the maximum distance that you should really be shooting an arrow at a bull elk? What broadhead are you using? I can't stress this enough, and I'm guilty of it myself when I was a younger hunter. This broadhead, I've shot. It's been in the rocks a couple times. It's kind of dulled up, but if it hits an animal, it's going to do some damage. It doesn't matter. Yes, it does matter. Sharpness in a broadhead is everything. And the reason you're shooting at an animal that's quite a bit bigger than a deer. Sharpness, if we can get an exit wound with that arrow, your odds of recovery are going to be much, much higher. Death is more intimate or going to be quicker, possibly. We have body fluids coming out two sides of the animal rather than one side. So equipment matters. I would say I do get those phone calls. I'm just sitting there listening to the guy. When a guy, and this has happened. Well, I took 100-yard shot with a mechanical broadhead. Okay, and I hit him high. Well, I'm that particular call right there. I told I'm not going to sit here and lecture guys on ethical shots, but let's be realistic. Shooting a mechanical broadhead takes a little bit more kinetic energy for it to work correctly. And 100-yard shot in a place on the animal that's probably not fatal, there's not a whole lot I can do. I mean, I could show up and try to run the track, but my chances of recovery are probably around 1 or 2%. So know your equipment, practice. And that's another thing, guys, everything about hunting, scouting, practicing, you're working up to your hunt. Guys can't really practice the recovery portion of it, and that's where the dog comes in. But the big one is know your equipment, and that's not just archery either. I'm going to extend this into the rifles. You shoot a bullet that even though you might use a round that is great in target and you could take long shots with, that hits paper consistently, what does that round do when you take a shot on an animal or an elk? How much kinetic energy is in that when it impacts? How does the bullet expand? Does it expand? Is it a target round that's deadly accurate, but when it hits, it doesn't expand, it just punches a pinhole through them? So you really need to research your ammunition, and you want to shoot something that's going to create the most amount of damage that is physically possible to make yourself successful, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll tell you a little story. I don't know if you have time or if you want to put this on there, but 2 years ago, I got called on a bull moose. Thing was shot with a crossbow. It was a pretty long shot, but there was 5 guides that witnessed the shot right behind the shoulder, and the bolt disappeared on this big bull moose. It was at last light, and he walked really slowly into the timber out of this meadow. They figured, let's go back to camp. Let's be in here in the morning, and we'll just walk down here and we'll break him up and get him out of here, right? They went in there and could not find him. They searched all day long. At one point, there was probably 10 to 15 outfitters in there looking for this bull moose. They showed me that when they called me at about the 24-hour mark, they had looked all day and couldn't find him. By the time I got in there the next morning, we were 36 hours after the shot. They showed me the map where they had grid searched, and I was like, there's no way my dog's going to figure this out. Because they had, crisscrossed the side of the mountain for at least a half mile, and there was a guy that walked probably about every 30 feet. Boom, 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 boom. We did a carcass search at the 5-day mark and found that bull at 1.5 miles out there. But what had happened is this guy had drawn this tag, hired an outfitter, and was told, hey, you can shoot him with archery during the September season. The guy probably had never shot a bow before in his life, so he went down to the sporting goods store, bought a raven, and bought a block target and practice. Probably shot that bolt into a block target 1,000 times and was pretty efficient with it. And this goes back to sharpness. The only thing we could figure out is he hit that bull with a broadhead that had been in a block target 1,000 times. And when it hit, it pushed all of the vitals out of the way. It did not cut him. And that bull was able to walk a mile and a half before he tipped over. And he probably tipped over around day 2. When I was in there looking or, trying to run the track with the dog, he was probably still on his feet. It's just how is every track that we do like that? Absolutely not. It's just one that kind of stands out in my mind, and I'll probably remember it for the rest of my life of what could happen and how vital it is to have a sharp broadhead.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. You mentioned distance there, and I did want to ask when your recoveries are successful, and we can talk about success rates in a second, but when your recoveries are successful, is there any sort of average recovery distance? I mean, you mentioned 50 yards, you mentioned a mile and a half. I'm sure there's a lot of variability, but what's
If I
common?
had to average them, combine them all together, and come up with one solid number, I would say it's probably about the 400 to 500 yard mark. Now you got to take into account there are tracks in there that 50 to 100 yards. It does happen. I've had several of them. Doing this as long as I have, I've shown up on tracks before, and I'm going behind the dog, and I've actually turned around and told the guy, "Why did you call me? I don't even need the dog. I can follow this bloodline." And colorblind guys that are colorblind, when guys call me
Yeah.
and tell me that what they have done and that they're colorblind, I'm going on that track. But that does happen. You can have tracks that sooner or they take the shot, double lung, and while they're waiting 2 hours, to go out and look for their animal, it either rains an inch or it gets a light covering of snow. Now they can't follow the line. Okay. So that's where we'll get to do a track on a double longer is weather has affected it. So we'll have lines that are they're very short. And on the reverse side, I've recovered deer and elk out there at the 2.5 to 3 mile mark. I don't think I've ever gone over 3 miles. I know I've been out there with the dog at 3 miles plus, but once you start getting out that far, is this animal really hurting that bad? But you start to average all them together. I would say we usually do the recovery between 400 to 500 yards.
You mentioned rain or snow. I did want to touch on that. Obviously, it affects us as the hunter trying to track, but what effects does that have with the dog and their capabilities?
Actually, most of us that run a tracking dog, we absolutely love the rain. Snow also, and what rain will do is, let's take for instance this last September. It was extremely dry here in the West. I was out there running tracks, at the end of September, at sundown, and I was still in a t-shirt. And it was, while we're running that line in the evening, it was anywhere between 80 and 90 degrees. Heat destroys scent. Rain on top of it, on the other hand, or if it's raining while we're on the line or drizzling, let's say you take a shot in the morning and it heated up to 70, 80 degrees during the day. And by the time we get there, it's still 70, 80, 90 degrees. Can the dog run that line? Yeah, but they might really struggle with it. If there is rain in the forecast overnight, let's try to run this line at daybreak the next day after it's been rained on, because it'll refreshen the line. And not necessarily just rain, overnight dew can refreshen the line, plus the coolness of the morning. You get out there at half an hour after sunup, and it's in the 30, 40 degrees. The dog won't overheat. The line has been refreshed with the coolness. And you could have a totally different dog, from the night before when it was 80 degrees, go in there in the morning when it's 40 degrees. The dog might not struggle at all with the line and run it perfectly. Snow, on the other hand, can do the same thing. What snow will do is kind of lock the scent close to the ground. So the scent is there, but it's covered with snow. And you can't have too much snow, but in September you're probably lucky if you have 3 or 4 inches, which would be a lot. Plus, it's probably wet and it's melting. As it's melting, it's refreshing the line. But it will lock that line or that scent in there. It can be impossible for the human to track, but be quite easy, a lot easier for the dog, just because the scenting conditions are perfect with that snow covering on it. You can actually sometimes follow, a dog will walk and they'll actually stick their nose into the snow and move their head back and forth trying to pick up that line, and they'll smell it. They'll walk 10 feet, stick their head in the snow, seeing if they're still on the same line, and continue the line. On a really wet covering of snow, sometimes you'll be behind a dog. I've seen it happen once, where we were following the dog, and as the dog was taking steps in the snow and lift its pad up, it'd compact that snow and it'd lift its foot up. That pad would start to turn red. There was so much blood under the snow that you could actually see the line in the dog's pad print, which is kind of
Mm,
cool.
that is very cool. If you put like whether it's yours personally or kind of your network of tracking teams, just talk about average success rate of the tracks that you're actually taking, of course. Like I know you're not taking everything, but you go out with your dogs, you've obviously already kind of pre-screened what this track is going to look like, what happened with the hunter. You have all that information. You decide, hey, yeah, let's show up, give this a shot. How often are you, and by you, I'm referring to you as well as your teams,
Okay.
successful?
Across the board, the magic number, and you're going to hear this from any tracking team, is 40%. Now you take the hunter who needs help, and if he can't follow the line, he's probably really close to 0% now. Now, if we could get a dog in there, our odds went from 0 up to 40%. And you're not going to just find that through Rocky Mountain Big Game Recovery tracking teams. That is a national average. If you ask a tracker in North Carolina what his success rate is, if he goes on every track he gets called on, he's going to tell you 40%. It's kind of the magic number. That's a big number. You got 60% that aren't recovered. Now, why is that? The big one is probably non-fatal hits. Okay, the animal isn't going to expire. It's probably going to survive the shot. Another one is private property lines. Hit a barbed wire fence. You call the landowner on the other side if you can even get a hold of them, and you can't continue the line. And there is times where the dog can have a bad day. They're just like humans. You can have a dog some days that just has a bad day and isn't going to work the line. Probably more so than the dog is the handler, a mistake made by the handler. And that does happen. Have I left animals in the woods? Absolutely. It happens to all of us. And I try to replay those tracks back in my mind. What did I do wrong? And a lot of times it is not the dog's fault. It is something that I have done as part of the tracking team. I mean, it's not all the dog, the human factor is a big part of this tracking team. And a lot of times it's the human side of the tracking team that made a mistake. Okay. So it's just a number of things why you might recover. But on average, if we drop the dog on every call we get, 40% of the time we're going to get a recovery.
What type of handler mistakes? Like what are examples of that? Like just not reading the dog well, you know, pushing too fast. Like what are handler
None of
mistakes?
us like to talk about it, okay? But it does happen. A big one is not trusting your dog. The I'm going to give you an example of one that I did here this last year. And is it my mistake? But it was a different, each track is a different scenario. There's no two tracks that are the same with each other. I learned something new on every track I go on. But I did have one this last year where it was a deer shot out of a tree stand. And the guy was able to watch the animal for about 30 minutes after the shot. He admitted flat out that he was a little bit far back, but it did exit out the other side. In fact, as the deer was walking away, the arrow was sticking out the other side of the deer as he was walking away. Now he was able to watch him for about 30 minutes, and then he disappeared into the timber. I got in there with the dog and we started the line. And I got in there about the 7 hour mark after the shot. There was a big event going on the next day. He wasn't going to be able to be there the next day. I wasn't going to be able to be there the next day. And it was like, we got to run this line because nobody's going to be able to run it tomorrow. Okay. The whole time I'm running this, I'm thinking, are we in here too early? But I'm at the 7 hour mark. I'm hoping that maybe he hit the liver and he bedded up within 400 yards and we're going to find this deer. We tracked this deer probably about 600 yards through a pasture, little bit of timber, and he hit a barbed wire fence. My hunter was there's no way he was hurting too bad. There's no way he jumped that fence. I got up to the line where the deer, where the dog had taken me, and I'm looking, and there was a tuft of hair in the barbed wire. Well, this deer did not jump the fence. He went through it. He went under it. But there were so many deer in the area. They're tuft of hair every once in a while on a piece of barbed wire. On the other side of the fence, though, was different terrain. It was a wheat stubble field. Jumped the fence, got over there, and actually found a couple of drops of blood in the wheat stubble. Okay. Now we know that he's come 600 yards. He's crossed his fence into this wheat stubble. And you can look across this wheat stubble field and go, geez, if he's laying out here, we're going to see him. You can see across it for a half mile, and the stubble is only 6 inches tall. Well, there was something about the conditions. It was dry. It was fairly warm. That wheat stubble did not hold the scent line. It took my dog probably about 30 minutes to 45 minutes to continue the line for maybe 100 yards. And it paralleled the fence. And all of a sudden the dog wanted to go back through the fence. And I'm like, there's no way that deer went back through that fence. And by God, where the dog wanted to go back through the fence, there was another tuft of hair in the barbed wire. Okay. We're into this track probably about 2 hours now, and we've only gone 600 yards. We followed the track for about another 600 yards. It gets into a creek bottom, into cattails and cottonwoods, and it had been a half a mile since I had seen any sign. All of a sudden, I look down, there's a drop of blood going into these cattails. Now I got confirmation we're still on the line. We followed it down through the timber there for probably another 400 yards. The sun is going down, and we get out on a point by a cottonwood tree, and I'm like, you get that whiff of deer. You know what I'm saying? I can smell it. He's laying right here, and I can't see him anywhere. And all of a sudden, the dogs take off through the cattails for about 100 yards on a dead run. I mean, I'm doing everything I can to keep up with them, holding on to the lead. I'm falling down in muck up to my knees, and we get to the other side of the cattails, up the bank, and boom, we're back into that damn wheat stubble, and the dog just stops. I'm like, what in the hell just happened? I could smell him back there. Why are my dogs dragging me through these cattails? Well, now the sun is going down, and where we're tracking, we're not allowed to track after dark. It's just like our hunting laws, right? I take the dogs back to, this is where the handler makes a mistake. I take the dogs back to the last where I could smell that deer. And I'm like, he's laying right here. I know he is, but where's he at? And we look and we look and we look, and we never do find that deer. Now it gets dark, and I walk back to the vehicle about a mile, tell the guy I don't know what happened. I could smell that deer in the out there on that point, you know, and I leave, and about 5 days later, I get a picture from the hunter. He goes, I found him. And what I think had happened is when we got on that point and I could smell that deer, I always knew on this line I was really keeping the dogs on a short lead because I thought we were going to jump this deer at any minute. We were in there too early. But when I could smell that deer, he had been standing beside that cottonwood tree for probably hours. And it was so fresh that I could smell him myself. And when the dogs took off running through the cattails, they were on him. They were like, we were just feet behind him there probably for a bit. And when he jumped out and crossed into that wheat stubble, the dogs still could not follow that line because from where I pulled him off at that wheat stubble, that deer was laying out in that wheat stubble 500 yards dead when he found him 5 days later. Now, there's a good chance where he died at the 500-yard mark, he was still on his feet. He died after we left. Okay. That's where myself as a handler, I feel like I made a mistake. You're in the heat of the moment, just like the hunter is. But I could not get over the fact that I could smell him back there 100 yards behind us. He's got to be laying back there. Well, no, he wasn't. He had been standing there long enough for me to smell him. But, darkness kind of ruled that one out also. I mean, there was no way we were going to continue the line after it got dark anyway. But that's where, myself as a handler can make that mistake.
Here's a big question that listeners for the last hour may have been wondering. What does this cost? Someone calls another tracker in the network. What are they
You're going
looking
to
at?
find anybody, in our organization, Rocky Mountain Big Game Recovery out here. A lot of the places we can't, where we track, we're not allowed to charge at all. Okay. Colorado is the big one. I mean, it's right in the state laws. You have to, in order to charge for anything to do with hunting and fishing, you have to be a licensed outfitter. Okay. So when it comes to the Colorado side, we do not charge. And it kind of falls over into most of the Western states. Even in Colorado, we're not even allowed to take gratuity. I do a lot of these when I'm on the Colorado side. I'm doing a lot of these tracks for the fun of it. Okay. I spent all this time training this dog. The only way to make your dog any better is to run tracks on with them, right? Other states that we're working in, you can legally charge, okay? But do I personally? No. I never give a guy a quote that I'm gonna require this much money to show up.
If I'm in a place where I can accept gratuity, yeah, gas is not cheap. Dog food's not cheap. With all the equipment my dogs are wearing, they all got the latest and greatest, Garmin tracking colors on them that, the whole setup cost about $2,000, but just
Mm-hmm.
your time and the fuel to get there and back, that does cost money. So, I do a lot of tracks for no cost. Okay. And sometimes guys can be very appreciative, and give you a pretty decent gratuity tip afterwards. I would say on average, a decent tip would be $200. At least help the guy pay for his fuel to get out there and help you back, get back home. So that's usually how much usually, if it's going to cost you anything, that's probably what it's going to be.
Gotcha.
So it's very inexpensive. Let me put it that way.
It's been super informative. I'm glad we were able to share this information. One, personally, I'm glad to know more about this, and two, just for the audience. I know we didn't, answer every question, cover everything. We will leave links in the show description, so that folks can go and learn more. And that is your website. You have a Facebook group, an Instagram, obviously the other organization, the United Blood Trackers. So we'll leave links to all that so that listeners can go and learn more. That said, is there any specific thing you want to make sure we mention that we didn't cover
If
yet?
I said something that intrigued you, or it's something that you possibly want to get into, is using a tracking dog and having your own dog. That's one of the main reasons we're out there. I don't need to promote my phone to ring anymore in September. What I do like to see is people get a hold of me and say, "Hey, can I be doing that too?" And sure, I'll anybody in our organization would help a new person to train a dog, to help them do it and do it legally. And ultimately, if they're having fun and successful with it, join our network, be part of it, and you can have a lot of fun just training and running your own dog and recovering other people's animals.
Well, there you have it, guys. Don't forget to check out the links in the show description to learn more, to see where trackers are in your area or the area you will be hunting. And if you have anything for us, reach out by email. Send it to podcast@exmountaingear.com. And also be sure to hit subscribe or follow in your podcast app if you haven't already, so that you receive future episodes automatically, as always for free. And we'll talk to you soon.